Hello world of YouTube and welcome to my next discography review, one that was voted on months ago by you, my followers, if you follow me on Twitter. And my poll was to celebrate 10 years, which discography review should I put in the current format? Should I do my first one, my most popular one, the funniest one to do, or my favorite band? And my favorite band one, which if you saw the video I dropped last week, you would know, it's 9 Inch Nails. So in this video, I'm going to be ranking the 9 Inch Nails studio discography and giving you guys a roadmap to the band if you've never listened to them before. If you would like to see my old discography review of it, which is linked in the description, it is in the old format, and I talk about things more chronologically, and I talk up until they broke up with The Slip. And I also talk about the remix albums, which I will not be talking about here, but I will also be talking about their EPs, at least their official studio ones, right now. Broken is still an essential piece of the 9 Inch Nails discography. It does a great job at bridging the sounds between Pretty Hate Machine and the Downward Spiral. And it's so dense and raw and a lot more in tune with the industrial scene at the time. While some of the electronics still sound a little like the Pretty Hate Machine stuff, like on Gave Up and on some of the sounds in Wish, a lot of it as a whole, even those songs are a lot more aggressive. The guitars are a lot more jagged and razor sharp. And tracks like Last and Happiness and Slavery, with how intense that song gets, would not have existed on Pretty Hate Machine, and do a good job at creating this more angry and nihilistic tinge to Trent's music, and it is so very good. So fucking perfect. Not the actual events. The first in a sequence of 3 consecutive releases to be released in a short period of time was a big surprise to me and a lot of the music community, because they got fucking dense and heavy on this release. Tracks like Burning Bright and Branches and Bones sound more like Godflesh influenced stuff than anything else the band had ever done in the past. But there are still tracks like Dear World and The Idea of You that toy with the sounds that 9 Inch Nails is known for in a much heavier potency. There's still an ounce of density and heaviness on this thing that is just so good. Out of the 3 releases, the trilogy of releases, this is my least favorite, only because it's the most brief and feels a little more one note. It's still like an 8 out of 10 to me. I fucking love this thing. It's a great tease and a good foundation for them to build upon on these 3 releases, and sees them experimenting more with noise and incorporating some of the ideas that they did on the soundtrack work that they had done in the past beautifully. It's also the first release featuring Atticus Ross as an official member of 9 Inch Nails, which is nice to see, and I like that they incorporated the film soundtrack stuff in some degree on some of the textures and sounds and scope of this project. And Add Violence was the second one, and I like it even fucking more because it does more to incorporate the 9 Inch Nails sound into these denser sounds that were started on Not the Actual Events. You know, Less Than is an incredibly synthetic sounding song that has some real noise built throughout the entire track listing. I love the background world. It's one of my favorite modern 9 Inch Nails songs. I love that they just have this loop that just gets more and more noisy as the song goes on. I'm trying to not go into too much detail on my opinions on some of the specific songs because I am planning a thing with these 3 releases. Spoiler for something happening down the line. But I will say this is as good as the other 2 EPs that they've done, and is, if you're a fan of industrial music and 9 Inch Nails and you haven't listened to this, you should really check it out. It's for fans that like the synthetic sounds that we're seeing on Hesitation Marks and Pretty Hate Machine, injected with a lot more noise and aggression seen on Not the Actual Events, and stuff like Broken and the Downward Spiral. Now, let's get into ranking their albums proper. So while this may seem like the weirdest thing to actually still include if I'm omitting the remix albums, any live albums, or anything like that from this catalog, but this was technically a released album as Nine Inch Nails and Trent Reznor. Not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but if I'm gonna put any of Trent Reznor's work at the bottom of the list as far as under the Nine Inch Nails moniker, it's the Quake soundtrack. Still great, still fucking amazing, and in hindsight, very interesting given where Trent's career went after Nine Inch Nails broke up. But there is still some good shit here. There's a lot of good thudding machinery sounds. There's a lot of dark ambience and eeriness to lend to the game's atmosphere, and it creates an atmosphere all its own. It almost feels like Aubrey Hodges' score to the Doom 64 soundtrack. It's very top tier, very quality, and I'm not surprised that they got Trent Reznor for this, because his sounds feel very indebted to id Software's games, and if he's gonna do any of them, he might as well do Quake, because he knows how to get intense and driving and ambient at the same time. Not a bad soundtrack by any stretch of the imagination, and clearly, if you know me in Nine Inch Nails, you know I still love this thing. I feel like if you want to hear where a lot of his influences for the soundtrack stuff may have been in a Genesis, check this album out. It's really interesting. As a fan of the band, it's very interesting to ever go back and revisit this. Honestly, this is the most normal Nine Inch Nails record in the entire catalog of the band, because it's not tied down to a lofty concept. There's no ideas behind its production that are interesting, and it's not their comeback album. It's just a Nine Inch Nails album that Trent put out for free. You know, it's not bad. Again, I don't really hate any of these records, but again, if I'm gonna put any Nine Inch Nails record in general on here, it's gonna be like this one as my least favorite. But again, with that being said, there's a lot of fucking good shit on here. 1 Million is a slamming track. When they played it live, I was surprised, but I was hyped, because I love the drums in this song. I love the main guitar lead. I like the danceable aspects and Discipline and Echoplex. I love the intensity in Letting You. I like the more ambient stuff near the end of the record, like The Four of Us Are Dying and Lights in the Sky. There's a lot of good songs here, and I'm amazed that he put something this quality out for free to kind of parallel, like, In Rainbows, and that's why I also put, like, this band's In Rainbows or whatever award I gave it. This is a quality release, and I liked so much, I bought a physical copy of it because it's so good. I wanted to support Trent, and I like this thing a lot. I think it's quality. It's a quality fucking release, and again, if I'm gonna put anything in the Nine Inch Nails near the bottom, it had to be this, unfortunately. I feel if you like the more straightforward industrial rock tinge stuff that was on With Teeth, you'll enjoy this record, and I feel like this is a good next step for that if you did like With Teeth. Now, while this album now has such a different legacy because of Lil Nas X, this, in its initial stage, was also just an interesting experiment for Trent to pull together. And it actually has Atticus Ross on a lot of this, so again, you get to see it as a progenitor stepping stone to get to the soundtrack work he would do later on, because this is just a collection of instrumentals and ambient and industrial tinged sounds that, again, feel very Nine Inch Nails, especially where Nine Inch Nails was at in this point in their career. But, I mean, it's not bad. It's really not bad at all. It's honestly very, very good. Like I said in my review, I don't normally cherry pick songs from this. If I'm gonna listen to it, I'm just gonna take an afternoon and just chill with this album, because it's fucking long, but it's good background noise. I wish more things like Old Town Road came of this since its release, but I'm glad that at least this has led to something like Old Town Road, because for those who don't know, if you want a little history about Old Town Road and stuff, this album was released under Creative Commons, which means, I mean, unless you're doing something like a commercial release, where Lil Nas X kind of falls into a weird ambiguous area, you're able to use this for any reason. It's under Creative Commons. You're able to do what you want with this project, essentially. And Trent has always been an advocate for copyright, which is why I think he didn't care when Lil Nas X made a big hit out of this song from this album. But this totally feels like something Trent would do. And as far as an album itself, that's one of the more interesting aspects of it, is that it is under Creative Commons, which allows people to remix it however they please. And it's cool. It's a neat album as a concept, and I think that a lot of the stuff here is interesting, again, especially in retrospect, given what Trent has done later on in his career. Now, out of the conceptual Nine Inch Nails records, this is my least favorite. But I like a lot of the work Trent put into this project, and I like that its lyrical themes reinforce a lot of the marketing that Trent put into this record, because Trent did the whole pirating, like, guerrilla marketing for this record, and I think it paid off to its credit, you know, because the whole album is about overthrowing the government. It's about this dystopian society where the president is like a god. You know, he signs his name with a capital G. And the songs themselves are honestly really good. You know, you have the driving stuff like Survivalism. You have the really poignantly written stuff like The Good Soldier and The Great Destroyer, which has an amazing breakdown in the end of it. I like tracks like God Given and My Violent Heart, which feel a lot more personal and evoke those same kind of Nine Inch Nails emotions. This is a strong record, and I feel like if you like politically charged, angry rock music and you haven't listened to Year Zero, I feel like it's an essential piece of that style of rock music. It is heavy, it is dense, it has a lot of good players in the pot too. Saul Williams was all over this thing. Again, Atticus Ross had production in this, and the people that he had around him during this record were all very essential pieces of Trent's style at the time. It's very indicative of Nine Inch Nails in the late 2000s, and I like this thing a lot. I like this thing a tremendous amount. I think it's really good. Again, not to the same quality as the later stuff. I feel like at this point in Trent's career, there's definitely some laurels sonically that he's resting on, but that said, he at least penned a really cool concept and portrayed it in an interesting way on this release. I feel like this is good if you like records like With Teeth. If you like With Teeth and you want something a little meatier conceptually, listen to Year Zero. If you like records like The Fragile and The Downward Spiral, but you want something not as bleak as far as personal lyrics go, listen to Year Zero. It's a good stepping stone record. It's for those that have gotten into the band and want something else. Go to this record. So I was all over covering this record before it came out. I talked about the singles that came out for it. I did track reviews for all of them. I talked about the album when it came out proper. And I gave it a review, actually, if I remember correctly. I did review this album when it came out, and I still love it. I still think it is an amazing record. I still revisit it a lot, and it's because it's like a heavier version of a record of theirs that you guys already know I love. This discography review is kind of difficult to talk about. It's kind of difficult to redo because a lot of my sentiments haven't changed that much outside of a few ones, and there's only like a few releases that they have released that I haven't talked about in some facet or another on the internet. I love this band. You guys know that. Hesitation Marks is still a record that I come back to because I like the dancey stuff like Satellite and the kind of dance nature of Running, even though it has the jittering guitars. I love Came Back Haunted. I think that it's an amazing fucking song. I love Copy of It. I like how it feels kind of hypnotic in nature. While I'm Still Here has become one of my favorite Nine Inch Nails songs, and I love the saxophone in it, and I'm glad that it's an element that they've revisited on subsequent releases. This is just a nice album. If you like Pretty Hate Machine and you like the dance-driven stuff on like Broken, but you want to see it in like a contemporary sense, listen to Hesitation Marks. It's a really amazing comeback and could have been a lot worse given Trent was doing a lot of different things around the time of this record's release. It's impressive that he still wrote quality jams when he did under this moniker and still made it distinct across all of the other projects he has going on. Sure, it still is very indicative of Trent Reznor, but it also feels solely Nine Inch Nails at the same time. And that's fascinating. The most recent release of the band, Bad Witch, which started off as an EP and they released as an album, shows the band going into some weird territories. They keep the noisiness and experimental edge on the subsequent EPs, but they inject more of that jazz element that was seen on the end of Hesitation Marks, even further on tracks like Play the Goddamn Part and God Break Down the Door. God Break Down the Door. This album is still so very good. I just wish it were longer, because it does at points feel like an extended EP, which, again, I see people's complaints to that. Personally, I think that because it's so different from the two EPs, because of that jazzy element, it adds this wonkier edge to the sound that isn't on the last two EPs. Sure, the noise is still there from the last two EPs, but there's also just this injection of bigger scope and treating it like a record. There is a reason why I'm going to incorporate it in something else that I said I'm going to be working on. But I feel like if you want one of the strongest outings this band has put out since With Teeth, you can't do wrong with Bad Witch. It has some of those Nine Inch Nails, sounds that people go to for them, but it also has a lot of new stuff, a lot of interesting stuff, and pulls influences from places that Trent and Atticus haven't really done before. I love this thing. I was re-listening to it the other day. It's still like a 10 out of 10 release to me. This thing is just so very good. I like how weird it is. I like just how unsettling and unnerving it is as well. It's just such a good record, man. Like, I get people saying that it's just another EP, but I feel like they did enough to expand it to make it an album, and it feels justified to me personally. Now, I used to call this my least favorite Nine Inch Nails record. I've now also talked about it elsewhere on the internet. I talked about the Brett DiCrescenzo review. I did it on the Discography review. I love this record. I do really love this record, and I like that it takes the lyrical ideas seen on the Downward Spiral and expands them even further and delves into other facets of the mindset of the protagonist from the Downward Spiral. I like a lot of the interludes that coat this thing, a lot of the instrumental passages. I like the denseness and thickness on tracks like The Day the World Went Away and Somewhat Damaged is such a fucking stomper. I like pretty much everything about this record, but Starfuckers. I still really fucking hate Starfuckers Incorporated. It feels like a B-tier Marilyn Manson song who already feels like a B-tier Trent Reznor, so I just do not like Starfuckers Incorporated. But the rest of the record is still aces. It's still very quality. I like the fatness and a lot of the production here. I like how the low end pops in a way that wasn't seen on the Downward Spiral or any Nine Inch Nails record since. This feels like it has its own identity that's tied together so very well across this feeling of fragility. It's a great record that has some emotional potency in a different way than has been seen in the band's catalog. I feel like if you like the Downward Spiral, you probably have already listened to this and you probably like it. But it's a good piece of the Nine Inch Nails discography. I feel like it's a good companion piece to a lot of the earlier work this band was doing. And yeah, it's really, really good, guys. This is a record that I know I shat talk a lot when my first discography review came out, but in the years that since I've talked about that record, I've come around to it a lot, in a lot of different ways. I've talked to a lot of people about this record since then, and they've made me see a lot of this album's strengths that I may have been overlooking because of my issues with some of its pacing and some of its construction as a whole. But also, just as my tastes have changed, I've grown to like a lot of the production ideals on this record more than, again, I may have when I first reviewed this band. It's a very strong record, and I feel like if you want something a little more experimental, if you like the Ghost album, or if you like this album, you might also like the Ghost project that came out that I talked about already. It's a good record, and it's a good experimental expansion for this band to go, and it makes sense after the Downward Spiral. This might be my hottest take, but this record's fucking amazing. I wrote a big review of this, which I'll also link in the description. I adore With Teeth. I think it makes sense for Trent. It's a little more straightforward. And again, if it weren't for the fact that this was his first record sober, this would feel like just another industrial rock Nine Inch Nails album. But because it is that his recovery seems to be a focal point of the lyrics of this, it gives it its own conceptual edge. I mean, even on Sunspots, he seems to try to redeem the mantra of the Downward Spiral, nothing can stop me now, and make it a much different sentiment. And I love that about it. I love that aspect of this record. I love that Dave Grohl is a big component of its sound, and I think his drums on this are so primal and tie into the humanistic nature that this album presents. I think that this has a lot of the musing seen in Trent's music when he was heavy in drugs. It's just channeled through a different facet. And again, feels like he's lashing out at a lot of the similar aspects, like his addiction, love, and all that sort of stuff, in a very different way on this. And I love this record for that. I think, yes, it's a little more straightforward sonically than The Fragile, but it has so many good moments on it. And I adore this thing. The end of Right Where It Belongs. Right Where It Belongs is one of my favorite closers of a Nine Inch Nails record. And it has the same potency and emotional weight to it that a song like Hurt does, in a very different way. Whereas Hurt feels like this very bleak, almost end of the razor's edge sort of song. Right Where It Belongs feels like this sort of outward look at yourself while trying to not relapse into your own shit. It is a great record. If there's one thing you pull from this record, it's listen to With Teeth. If you like rock music, if you like rock music with a little more edge, and you want something that's a little more emotionally potent than, say, like your standard rock album, listen to With Teeth. It's a good record, and I would wager it's a better starting point for people than, say, The Fragile. It's a little more straightforward. It has more hook-centric songs, and it's a tighter release, but I think that gives people a better jumping-on point than that. It doesn't have the higher concept of, like, a Year Zero. It doesn't have the weird sonic vignettes that, say, a Bad Witch does. It doesn't have the sort of revivalist sound that Hesitation Marks does. It's just a cut-the-bullshit record that I think channels into itself really, really well. I think Trent made something fantastic here. And yeah, give it a shot. Give it another spin if you haven't listened to it in a while. Again, I've talked about this record a couple times on the internet, The Downward Spiral, and it's one of those records that's talked to death on the internet. It's a classic because it's so goddamn good and is great at painting a picture of true bleakness, depression, and anger in a lot of instances. I know people know Closer, they love Closer, but tracks like March of the Pigs and Hurt have also gotten really big in their own respective scenes. There's a lot in this record that works for its own, emotional reasons. Trent's channeling some true dark shit here, and it could have been because he was just deep in some drugs and deep in some depressive mindsets, but he channeled it into a truly breathtaking release that has a lot of great experimental moments on here. He even channels David Bowie on A Warm Place by kind of reworking Crystal Japan into something else and giving it a sense of warmth, which makes sense because he is a big David Bowie fan, so David Bowie would be a warm place for Trent Reznor. I don't know, there's a lot of meta text in this album's composition, songwriting, and stuff, and it's good. It's worth looking into. This is a great starting point to get into Nine Inch Nails because it is so dripping with emotion and power, with its lyrics, its composition, its production is so pounding and powerful. When Mr. Self-Destruct really starts running, it just gets you going. The drums, so the haphazard drum solo on Piggy is so pronounced and powerful. It is good. It is a classic. It is something that a lot of people understandably love, myself included, given that these guys are my favorite fucking band. But of course, you already know what number one is. It's anytime I tell people Nine Inch Nails are my favorite band, they expect me to just absolutely worship the Downward Spiral, which I do. And after having gone through some incredibly bleak, moments in life that I hadn't faced after my first review. I got an even bigger appreciation for a record I had already loved for so long. But one constant always remained the same. This record is just better to me. Yes, it's not as dense and heavy in concept as the Downward Spiral or the Fragile. Yes, it is very indebted to the 80s as a sound, but that's what I love about it. I love that it takes some of the 80s style and drums percussion, like on Down In It, and on Sin, and on Ring Finger, and morphs it into a much more angry, angsty sound. The guitars on here are still very razor sharp, and Trent's voice still cuts through some of these songs like fucking butter, like Head Like a Hole, Terrible Lie, Something I Can Never Have has the emotional potency of the Downward Spiral, but it's in a fucking piano ballad. Again, this is an album I've talked about to death. I've made a video specifically about it. It was in my top 10 albums of all time video. It's in my original discography review. It's in this discography review. I don't know how many times I can say that I love this album, but I do. I mean, I buy tribute albums and merch for those albums, for that album. I just am enamored with this album's sound. I love the story of the recording of this album. While yes, Broken and the Downward Spiral have interesting stories because they were recorded in like the Tate House and all this sort of stuff, I like that this is just a guy working his job and making an incredibly powerful record at the same time. I draw a lot of personal influence and inspiration from this record, which could factor into why it's one of my favorites. But even before that, I just love that Trent was able to write such angry and counterculture-centric songs that were also very indebted to adapting the existing culture into something else. While yes, you could say that these songs are a lot more pop-centric, it's just more influenced by like KMFDM than like Godflesh and Coil. You know what I mean? There's a lot of good sounds on Pretty Hate Machine that are indicative of electro-industrial, and as a fan of that subgenre, I love this record, and I think it's the best it has to offer. And I feel like if you like 80s sounds more, or if you've been a fan of the 80s revival that's been going on over the last decade or so, and you haven't listened to Pretty Hate Machine by Nine Inch Nails, you need to, because it's so good. It's such a good record. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Nine Inch Nails. Again, with updates to my discography ranking, and reestablishing why Pretty Hate Machine is the best record ever made. Let me know what you thought about this. Let me know what you think of reformatting a discography review into this modern format. I don't plan on doing it really much after this, but I did want to do this one because it's my favorite band. People wanted to see it, and I'm giving the people what they voted for. Let me know what you think of Nine Inch Nails in the description or in the comments down below. Link below again. Any Nine Inch Nails reviews I've done a lot of Nine Inch Nails content. It's the most on-brand thing for me because I love Trent. I love Trent Reznor. I love Atticus Ross. I love the people that he's surrounded himself with on tour and in the studio. I think that he's an amazing musician, and yeah, he's a good guy. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you liked it, please be sure to like. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content that I bring. I'm going to get out of here. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lots of situations, and I'll see you another day.